A brutal police officer chained up and beat a police dog until a military veteran and a German shepherd appeared. What could make a moment like this change everything? And what happens when unexpected courage steps forward? Welcome, everyone, to our channel. We are grateful to have you here for another emotional journey filled with hope and compassion. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being part of this community and supporting our work. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time is it there right now. Now let us begin the story. The dog behind that door was not waiting for a hero. He was waiting for someone to believe he still mattered. The cold morning air moved quietly through the empty streets, and one question remained unanswered. What would make a military veteran stop when everyone else kept walking away? And what could happen when a wounded spirit finally found someone willing to listen? Welcome, everyone, to our channel. Today, we share another emotional journey about compassion, loyalty, and the unexpected bonds that can change lives. If you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being here and supporting our community. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time is it there right now. Now let us begin the story. The days after Ethan Walker found Duke were quiet, but they carried a weight that words could not easily explain. The old farmhouse outside the small Ohio town remained peaceful, with only the sound of wind moving through the fields and the soft footsteps of two German shepherds crossing the wooden floor. Ethan knew healing would not happen overnight. He had learned that during his years in the military, some battles were not visible. Some wounds did not appear on the outside. They lived quietly in the memories, the hesitation, and the moments when trust felt impossible. That was why he never rushed Duke. Every morning, Ethan followed the same simple routine. Fresh water, a calm voice, a little space, no pressure. He understood that trust was not something he could take from Duke. It was something Duke had to choose to give. Bear, Ethan's German shepherd, seemed to understand this better than anyone. The dog never pushed closer than Duke allowed. He simply stayed nearby, showing Duke that not every presence carried fear. Slowly, small changes began to appear. Duke started looking toward Ethan when he entered the room. He began resting in places where he could see the people around him. He no longer spent every moment watching the doorway. To anyone else, these details might have seemed small, but Ethan knew they were enormous. He had seen people rebuild their lives one small step at a time. He knew that progress was not always loud. Sometimes progress was simply choosing to stay. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch holding his old dog tag in his hand. The metal felt cold against his fingers, reminding him of the years he spent serving his country. He thought about the moments after returning home, when he had to learn how to live in a world that felt different. He remembered the silence, the distance, the feeling of being surrounded by people but still feeling alone. Looking at Duke resting near the doorway, Ethan realized why they understood each other. They both knew what it felt like to carry a story that others could not see. The next morning brought another quiet surprise. Ethan opened the back door, and Bear walked outside first. Duke watched carefully from inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Duke slowly followed. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply stepped into the morning sunlight. Ethan stood still, allowing the moment to belong completely to Duke. The German shepherd looked across the open field, feeling the cool breeze and the warmth of the sun. It was only a few seconds, but Ethan knew it mattered. Later that day, Ethan contacted someone who had known Duke before. He wanted to understand more about the dog's past. Not because he was searching for blame, but because he believed every story deserved to be heard. The person on the phone described Duke as a remarkable K9, a dog with intelligence, loyalty, and a strong desire to serve. Hearing those words, Ethan looked over at Duke and smiled. The dog he saw now was not a broken version of who he once was. He was still there beneath the uncertainty. He was still the same loyal companion waiting for someone to believe in him. As the sun lowered behind the trees, Ethan watched Bear and Duke resting in the yard. Two German shepherds with completely different journeys were now sharing the same peaceful space. Ethan knew there was still a long road ahead. There were still questions without answers. There were still memories that needed time. But for the first time, Duke was not facing that journey alone. And sometimes, that is where healing truly begins. Not when everything becomes perfect, but when someone finally stays. The morning light entered through the kitchen window, painting soft golden lines across the wooden floor. Ethan Walker stood quietly with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching two German shepherds resting in the yard. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary, peaceful moment. But Ethan knew something extraordinary was happening. A dog who once looked like he had forgotten how to trust was beginning to remember what kindness felt like. Duke was changing, but the change was happening in whispers. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden transformation, just small pieces of hope appearing one day at a time. Ethan had learned during his years in the military that the strongest recoveries were often the quietest ones. They happened when someone chose patience instead of pressure. That was exactly what Duke needed. Every afternoon, Ethan walked with Bear and Duke along the old country road behind the house. Bear always stayed close, moving at the same slow pace as Duke. The two dogs were different in many ways. Bear had always known safety. Duke was still learning what safety meant. Yet somehow, they understood each other without needing words. One afternoon, Ethan noticed something that made him stop in the middle of the path. Duke had walked ahead of them, only a few steps. But it was the first time Duke had chosen to move forward without waiting for someone else. Ethan smiled softly and whispered, "Good boy." Duke looked back. His ears lifted slightly. It was a small reaction, but Ethan felt the meaning behind it. Duke was listening. He was beginning to believe. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the porch while Bear rested beside his chair. Duke remained a few feet away, watching the sunset across the fields. The orange sky reflected in his eyes, and for the first time, Ethan saw something different there. Not fear, not uncertainty, curiosity, a desire to understand this new life. Ethan thought about how many people would have looked at Duke and only seen a problem. A dog with too much history. A dog who needed too much patience. But Ethan saw something else. He saw a loyal heart that had simply been waiting for someone to recognize it. The next few weeks brought more changes. Duke started greeting Ethan in the mornings. He began spending more time near Bear. Sometimes the two dogs would lie together beneath the shade of the old oak tree, watching birds move across the sky. These moments reminded Ethan that healing did not always require explanations. Sometimes it only required presence. One evening, a letter arrived at Ethan's mailbox. It was information about Duke's past, sent by someone who had worked with K-9 units before. Ethan held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. He knew the truth about Duke mattered. Not because he wanted to reopen old pain, but because every loyal companion deserved to have their story understood. Inside were details about Duke's training, his dedication, and the respect he once earned. Ethan read every word carefully. The dog beside him was not just a German shepherd who needed help. He was a former K-9 who had given his best and deserved a second chance. Ethan looked over at Duke and placed the letter down. "You were never forgotten," he quietly said. Duke lifted his head and walked closer than he ever had before. He did not need to speak. He did not need to prove anything. The simple choice to come closer said enough. Under the fading evening sky, Ethan realized something important. He had rescued Duke from a lonely moment, but Duke was rescuing something inside Ethan too. Two souls, both carrying invisible stories, were slowly finding peace in the same place. And sometimes, the greatest miracles are not the ones that change everything at once. They are the quiet ones that begin with a single step forward. The letter on Ethan Walker's table stayed open long after the evening light disappeared. The words inside were not just information about Duke's past. They were pieces of a life that had almost been forgotten. Ethan ran his fingers across the paper, reading every detail again. Duke had once been known as a dedicated K-9, a German shepherd with focus, intelligence, and a deep desire to serve. The dog beside him was not a different animal. He was the same loyal companion hidden beneath years of uncertainty. Ethan understood that some stories were not about what was lost. They were about what could still be found. The next morning, Ethan decided to learn more. Not because he wanted answers for himself, but because Duke deserved to have his story respected. He contacted people who had known the K-9 before his life changed. Each conversation revealed the same thing. Duke had always been special. He was the kind of dog who noticed everything. The kind of dog who remembered voices, routines, and the people who treated him with care. But somewhere along the way, that confidence had faded. Ethan listened quietly as each person shared their memories. He did not judge. He simply listened. That was something he had learned long ago. Sometimes people and animals did not need someone to fix everything immediately. Sometimes they needed someone willing to hear them. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Duke continued discovering his new life. Every day brought another small moment of progress. He followed Bear into the yard. He rested closer to Ethan's chair. He began waiting near the kitchen in the mornings, knowing that a familiar routine was coming. These were simple things, but Ethan noticed every single one. One afternoon, Ethan watched Bear and Duke beneath the old oak tree. The two German shepherds looked completely different, yet somehow they belonged together. Bear had become the quiet guide Duke never expected to find. He showed Duke that friendship did not demand anything. It simply offered a place to stand. Ethan smiled as he watched them. He thought about how often the world judged things too quickly. A person could look at Duke and only see his difficult days. They could see the hesitation, the distance, and the uncertainty. But they would miss the heart underneath. They would miss the loyalty that was still there. That evening, Ethan received another message. Someone wanted to share a memory about Duke from his earlier days. It was a story about a German shepherd who always stayed alert, always cared about his team, and always tried to do what was expected of him. Ethan looked across the room at Duke sleeping peacefully. For a moment, he imagined the confident dog that once walked proudly beside others. Then he looked at the dog in front of him and realized something important. Duke did not need to become his old self again. He was creating a new chapter. A chapter where he was not defined by what happened before. A chapter where he could simply be Duke. As the days passed, Ethan noticed another change. Duke was beginning to protect something again. Not because he was following a command. Not because someone expected it from him. He was protecting the bond he had found. When Ethan came home after a short trip into town, Duke was waiting near the door. The dog stood quietly, looking at him with a calmness Ethan had never seen before. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no grand celebration. Just a man and a dog sharing a silent understanding. Ethan placed his hand gently on Duke's head and whispered, "You are home now." Outside, Bear rested nearby under the fading sunlight. 3 lives that once carried loneliness were slowly becoming something new. Ethan, Duke, and Bear were no longer 3 separate stories. They were becoming one. And somewhere between trust and patience, a forgotten dog was finding his way back to the world. The morning sun rose slowly above the quiet fields, covering Ethan Walker's farmhouse with a warm golden light. Inside the house, everything felt peaceful. The sound of 2 German shepherds moving across the wooden floor had become something Ethan never expected to hear again. It was a sound of trust, a sound of belonging. But even in this peaceful moment, Ethan knew there was still a part of Duke's story waiting to be understood. Some memories do not disappear simply because a new chapter begins. They stay quietly in the background, waiting for someone brave enough to face them with compassion. Ethan had spent his life protecting others, but he had learned that true strength was not always about standing in front of danger. Sometimes, true strength was standing beside someone who had lost hope. That was why he continued searching for answers about Duke's past. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, only because every loyal companion deserved to have their story respected. Days later, Ethan received a call from someone who had worked around K-9 units. The voice on the other side of the phone carried years of memories. They described Duke as a remarkable German shepherd, a dog with sharp instincts, a calm spirit, and an incredible ability to connect with people. Ethan listened carefully as stories from Duke's earlier days came back to life. He heard about the confidence Duke once carried. He heard about the way the dog responded to those who treated him with kindness. It was difficult for Ethan to imagine that same confident dog hidden beneath the uncertainty he saw now. But he knew something important. The heart of Duke had never disappeared. It was only waiting for the right environment to return. That afternoon, Ethan sat outside with Duke and Bear. The 2 German shepherds rested beneath the shade of the oak tree while a gentle breeze moved through the grass. Ethan looked at them and thought about how easily people could misunderstand a story. A person could see a quiet dog and assume he had nothing left to offer. They could see hesitation and mistake it for weakness. But Ethan saw something different. He saw courage. He saw a companion who was trying every day to believe again. Bear suddenly lifted his head and walked closer to Duke. The 2 dogs touched noses briefly before settling back down beside each other. It was a simple moment, but Ethan smiled. Sometimes the deepest friendships were created without a single word. That evening, another message arrived. This time, it contained information about the people connected to Duke's difficult past. Ethan read it slowly. He understood that the truth mattered, but he also understood something else. Holding on to anger would never heal Duke. The best way to honor Duke's journey was to help him discover peace. Ethan placed the message aside and walked toward the porch. Duke followed behind him. The German Shepherd no longer stayed far away. He no longer watched every movement with uncertainty. He simply walked beside Ethan, choosing to be close. As the sky turned orange, Ethan sat down and looked across the field. He remembered the first day he saw Duke. The dog had been surrounded by uncertainty, but now he was surrounded by patience, friendship, and care. Ethan knew the road ahead was not finished. Healing was not a straight path. There would still be difficult days. There would still be moments when old memories returned. But Duke was no longer facing those moments alone. And that changed everything. Because sometimes, the greatest gift we can give another soul is not an answer. It is a place where they finally feel safe enough to find their own. The days became quieter at Ethan Walker's farmhouse, but the silence no longer felt empty. It carried a different meaning now. It was the peaceful silence of trust being built, one moment at a time. Every morning, Ethan opened the back door and watched Bear step outside first, followed by Duke moving carefully behind him. The sight still amazed him. A few weeks earlier, Duke had been a German Shepherd who seemed unsure of every step. Now, he was beginning to understand that this place was not temporary. This was home. Ethan knew that healing was not measured by big moments. It was measured by the small ones that most people never noticed. The way Duke rested closer than before. The way he looked toward Ethan when hearing his voice. The way he followed Bear without hesitation. Those small signs told Ethan everything he needed to know. Duke was coming back to himself. One afternoon, Ethan received another message from someone who had followed Duke's story. They wanted to know how the German Shepherd was doing. Ethan smiled before answering. He looked outside at Duke lying beneath the oak tree and thought about how different things were now. He remembered the first day when Duke seemed lost inside his own thoughts. Now, the dog lifted his head whenever Ethan called his name. It was a simple response, but it carried something powerful. Recognition, trust, connection. Later that week, Ethan took Duke and Bear on a longer walk through the fields behind the farmhouse. The sky was clear, and the golden grass moved gently with the wind. Bear walked ahead, stopping every so often to look back. Duke followed at his own pace, no longer afraid of falling behind. Ethan walked quietly behind them, allowing the dogs to choose their own rhythm. He knew trust could not be rushed. It had to grow naturally. As they reached the edge of the property, Duke stopped near an old wooden fence. He looked across the open land for a long moment. Ethan wondered what memories were passing through the dog's mind. Then Duke turned around and walked back toward him. That choice meant more than any command ever could. Duke was not returning because he had to. He was returning because he wanted to. Ethan placed a hand gently on Duke's shoulder and felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The dog had given him a reminder that every living soul carries a story beneath the surface. Some stories are easy to understand. Others require patience. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Bear and Duke nearby. The sunset painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. For the first time in years, Ethan felt completely present in the moment. He thought about his life after the military. There had been days when he wondered where he belonged. Days when the world felt distant. But now, sitting there with two German shepherds beside him, he understood something he had forgotten. Home was not always a place. Sometimes home was a feeling created by the ones who chose to stay. The next morning, Ethan noticed something unusual. Duke was waiting near the front door before Ethan even stepped outside. The dog looked up with calm eyes, ready for the day ahead. Ethan smiled softly. "You were waiting for me," he said. Duke's tail moved gently as Bear approached beside him. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of everything they had built together. The journey was not finished. There were still questions about Duke's past. There were still people who needed to understand what happened. But Ethan no longer saw Duke as a dog trying to recover from yesterday. He saw him as a companion creating tomorrow. And as the morning sun rose over the quiet farmhouse, Ethan realized something beautiful. Sometimes the souls we help find their way home are the same souls that quietly guide us back to ourselves. The farmhouse had become a place where second chances quietly grew. Every morning, Ethan Walker watched the same peaceful routine unfold. Bear would step outside with confidence, and Duke would follow with a calmness that once seemed impossible. The two German shepherds moved through the yard like they had always belonged there. For Ethan, those moments were reminders that patience could rebuild what the world had almost forgotten. But one morning, something happened that showed him just how far Duke had truly come. Ethan was preparing breakfast when he heard a soft sound near the back door. He turned and saw Duke standing there, waiting. It was not unusual anymore for Duke to be nearby, but this time felt different. The dog was not simply following a routine. He was asking to be included. Ethan opened the door and smiled. "Come on, buddy." Duke walked inside without hesitation. It was a simple step across a doorway, but Ethan understood the meaning behind it. A place that once felt unfamiliar had become a place of comfort. Over the following days, Ethan noticed more signs of confidence returning. Duke began exploring different areas of the property. He would walk near the garden, rest beside the porch, and watch the world around him with peaceful curiosity. He was no longer only surviving each day. He was experiencing it. Bear remained close throughout the changes. The older German shepherd seemed to understand exactly when Duke needed encouragement and when he needed space. Their friendship was not built through commands or expectations. It was built through quiet moments of trust. Ethan often watched the two dogs together and thought about how rare that kind of connection was. One evening, a neighbor stopped by the farmhouse. They had heard about Duke's journey and wanted to see how he was doing. Ethan welcomed them inside, but he did not expect what happened next. When the neighbor entered the room, Duke slowly approached. He did not hide behind Ethan. He did not stay across the room. He simply walked forward and calmly greeted a new person. The neighbor looked surprised. "He seems like a completely different dog," they said softly. Ethan smiled because he knew the truth. Duke was not a different dog. He was finally able to show who he had always been. Later that night, Ethan sat outside under the stars. The quiet fields stretched endlessly around him. Bear rested near his feet, while Duke lay beside the porch steps. Ethan thought about all the moments that brought them here. The first uncertain days, the slow progress, the tiny signs of trust that others might have missed. Every moment mattered. Ethan also thought about his own journey. He had spent years learning how to serve, protect, and carry responsibility. But Duke had taught him something just as important. Healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about discovering that the past did not have to control the future. The next morning, Ethan found something that made him pause. A small toy that Duke had ignored for weeks was now lying beside his bed. It was a simple object, but Ethan smiled. Duke was creating his own space, his own habits, his own feeling of home. That afternoon, Ethan took Bear and Duke for another walk through the fields. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and the dogs walked side by side. Ethan followed behind, watching them disappear briefly into the golden sunlight before returning to him. In that moment, he realized something beautiful. He had opened his door for a lost German shepherd, but Duke had opened a door inside his own heart as well. And sometimes, the souls we think we are saving are the ones quietly teaching us how to begin again. The seasons began to change around Ethan Walker's farmhouse, but the bond between three unlikely companions only grew stronger. The fields that once felt empty now carried the sound of footsteps, gentle movements, and the quiet happiness of a place that had become a true home. Ethan often stood near the porch in the early mornings, watching Bear and Duke move through the grass. He still remembered the first time he saw Duke. The uncertainty in the dog's eyes. The distance he kept. The way he seemed unsure if kindness would last. Now, that same German shepherd walked with confidence. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the present finally gave him something worth believing in. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected visit from someone connected to Duke's earlier life. The visitor carried old memories and a story that Ethan had been waiting to understand. They sat together on the porch while Bear and Duke rested nearby. The conversation was not about blame. It was about remembering the dog Duke had always been. Ethan listened as they described the German shepherd's dedication, his intelligence, and the loyalty that made people respect him. Hearing those words, Ethan looked toward Duke and smiled. The dog was not lost. He had simply needed a place where his heart could feel safe again. After the visitor left, Ethan stayed outside for a long time. The evening sky slowly changed colors above the fields. Duke walked over and rested beside him, something that would have been impossible when they first met. Ethan placed his hand gently on the dog's back and felt a quiet gratitude. He realized that Duke had taught him something he needed to remember. Everyone carries a story. Some stories are written in obvious ways. Others are hidden behind silence, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The following week, Ethan decided to take Bear and Duke on a longer trip into town. It was not a special event. It was simply another step in helping Duke experience the world again. As they walked through the quiet streets, Ethan noticed how different Duke was. The dog looked around with interest instead of uncertainty. He watched people pass by and calmly accepted the sounds around him. Bear stayed close, as if reminding Duke that he was never alone. When they returned home, Ethan opened the front gate and watched both German shepherds walk into the yard together. It was a sight he never wanted to forget. 2 dogs, 2 journeys, 1 place they could finally call home. That night, Ethan found himself looking through old photographs from his military years. He remembered faces, places, and moments that shaped who he became. For many years, he believed strength meant carrying everything alone. But Duke had shown him another kind of strength. The strength to accept help. The strength to begin again. The strength to open a door and allow another soul inside. The next morning brought a small surprise. Ethan woke up and found Duke waiting beside the bedroom door. The dog looked peaceful, almost as if he had made a decision. He was no longer just staying because Ethan had given him a place to stay. He was staying because he had chosen this family. Ethan smiled and reached down. "Good morning, Duke." Bear appeared behind him, and the 3 of them stepped outside into the fresh morning air. The sunlight covered the farmhouse in warmth. The fields moved gently with the breeze. Everything looked ordinary, but Ethan knew better. Sometimes the greatest changes happen quietly. Sometimes a lost soul does not need a perfect ending. Sometimes they only need someone who believes they are still worthy of love. And in that quiet farmhouse, a veteran and 2 German shepherds had discovered something greater than rescue. They had discovered belonging. The morning arrived quietly at Ethan Walker's farmhouse, carrying the same peaceful rhythm that had slowly become their new normal. The sound of the front door opening. The soft steps of 2 German shepherds walking across the porch. The gentle wind moving through the fields. These were simple moments, but Ethan knew they were precious. Years earlier, he never imagined his life would look like this. He had spent so much time carrying responsibility, protecting others, and learning how to stand strong through difficult seasons. But now, his greatest lessons came from 2 dogs who had shown him the meaning of patience, trust, and unconditional loyalty. Duke was no longer the uncertain German shepherd who struggled to believe in kindness. He was no longer a dog defined by what happened before. He was Duke, a loyal companion, a friend, a member of the family. One afternoon, Ethan sat on the porch while Bear and Duke rested nearby. He looked across the yard and smiled as he remembered their first days together. Back then, every small step felt like a victory. A closer look, a calmer breath, a moment of trust. Now, those small moments had grown into something much bigger. Duke followed Ethan through the yard. He waited near the door. He leaned closer when Ethan sat beside him. The connection they shared no longer needed to be proven. It simply existed. Later that week, Ethan received a letter from someone who had heard about Duke's journey. Inside was a message of gratitude. It thanked Ethan for giving a forgotten German shepherd a second chance. Ethan read the words carefully, but he knew something important. He had not saved Duke alone. Duke had saved something inside him too. The veteran who once believed he had to carry every burden by himself had learned that healing could come through companionship. That evening, Ethan took Bear and Duke for one final walk across the open fields behind the farmhouse. The sun was setting slowly, painting the sky with warm colors. Bear moved ahead with confidence, while Duke walked beside Ethan. The 2 dogs looked peaceful, as if they understood that they had finally arrived at the place they were meant to be. Ethan stopped near the old wooden fence and looked back at the farmhouse. It was not a large home. It was not a perfect home, but it was filled with something far more valuable. It was filled with trust. As the 3 of them returned, Ethan noticed something that made him pause. Duke stopped near the doorway and looked back toward the field. For a moment, Ethan wondered if the dog was remembering everything he had left behind. Then Duke turned around and walked inside. He had made his choice. He was home. Months passed, and the farmhouse continued to hold quiet moments of happiness. Neighbors would sometimes see Ethan walking with the two German shepherds and smile. They saw a veteran and two dogs. But Ethan knew the deeper story. They were three souls who had found each other when they needed it most. One had lost confidence. One had lost direction. One had forgotten what it felt like to belong. Together, they discovered that second chances do not always arrive with a loud announcement. Sometimes they arrive softly. Sometimes they appear as a dog waiting by the door, a companion sitting beside you, a quiet presence reminding you that you are not alone. On a peaceful evening, Ethan sat on the porch as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the fields. Bear rested near his feet. Duke lay beside him, completely at peace. Ethan looked at the two German shepherds and smiled. He finally understood that rescue was never just about giving someone a better life. Sometimes, rescue is about two hearts finding each other and becoming whole again. And in that small farmhouse surrounded by open fields, a veteran and two loyal dogs prove that even the smallest act of kindness can create a miracle that lasts forever.